That was a third movement from my piece Into the Fire. I played another movement in an earlier episode, but that was From the Rain, whereby ethereal beings join in an assemblage ready to perform their functional roles in the final rapturous dance. If the purpose of my inquiry is to investigate the importance of ideas represented in the Weimar tradition in terms of, firstly, the mind-body problem, secondly, music, and in particular my own music, and thirdly, education, and in particular that pertaining to the international school in Weimar, then in this episode I want to introduce a theory of functionalism to my considerations, and various objections to the theory too, in particular those raised by phenomenalism and the zombie argument. I'm heading with my family to the Kickelhahn Mountain hut near Elmenau, which is the southern end of what used to be the Dukedom of Saxe-Weimar. 200 years ago it would have been several hours in a horse-drawn carriage from Weimar. Today it's about 45 minutes drive. It's the highest mountain in what was the Grand Duchy of Saxe-Weimar-Eisenach until the end of the First World War. It takes its name, the Kickelhahn, from the grouse that were once common in the forests. I'm just heading over to the remaining foundations of one particular building here that's obviously lost its original function. It was an old hunting lodge used for the ducal hunts. Now its only remaining function is to act as a backdrop to inquiries such as this that want to consider the very nature of functionalism. In the post-behaviourist era, there was a general adoption of identity theory as the best alternative to dualism and the would-be recourse to the non-physical. But the consensus didn't last long. As I said in a previous episode, materialist identity theory, as a means to describe the interrelationship between mind and body, fell out of favour in many quarters because it couldn't explain the causal process by which mental states could identify with brain states. In arguing that mental states are identical to brain states, the theory had encompassed the implausible notion that any particular mental state was dependent upon a particular brain state. But this argument didn't explain how any particular mental state could be correlated with different physical states. For instance, two people might have the same thought or the same feeling or the same desire, but that experience might be caused by very different physiological states. Similarly, if it was argued that certain species of animals experienced, for instance, the mental state of pain in the same way as people, as demonstrated by their reactions, but it was also demonstrated that the physiology of the animal was different, for instance, that the physiology of their synapses had different physical characteristics, then it must be concluded that certain mental states could be created by different physical states. To handle these objections, identity theory resorted to a more compromising notion of token-token identity, whereby mental states could be identified with, if not a particular physiological event, then at least some sort of physiological event. That's to say, any mental state corresponds to a physical state, but according to the theory, what that physical state is precisely is left undetermined. Consequently, in this case, the identity is only a causal one. It doesn't require that specific instances of mental state, such as a sensation of pain, correspond with specific instances of brain state, such as a specific network of synapse communication. I have a graphic to demonstrate this. It's supposed to illustrate how the exact match between a mental state and a particular physiological state, as characterized by type identity, and shown in the top row, was relaxed into the token-token identity of the second row, where the causal relationship of identity, shown by the equal sign, held, but the specificity didn't. One person's experience of pain or of music is not going to be realized in the brain in the same way as another person's. These ideas were developed at the same time as the first computers, and theorists were quick to make the analogy between mind and brain, and software and hardware. The third line of my remarkable graphic shows how mental states might be seen as a result of software that's running on the physical hardware of the brain, or indeed of any physical system, even the silicon of an alien's brain. By the way, my son has verified that the cloud shape donates fairly accurately the silicon infrastructure of a typical alien's brain. This even broader approach to equivalency made the notion of identity rather meaningless, and accordingly it was suggested that actually the mental state should be characterised in a completely different way. It was not enough to say it was the same as a physical state, it should be considered as a function of that state. Janet Levin said, "Functionalism is the doctrine that what makes something a mental state of a particular type does not depend on its internal constitution, but rather on the way it functions, or the role it plays in the system of which it's a part." This is the Goethe house. It was built by Duke Karl August in summer 1783 as a hunting lodge immediately below the Kickelhahn peak. Goethe first came here in his capacity as Minister of Mines. He was involved in trying to reopen a silver mine in the area, and thereafter he came back almost every summer to observe the hunts and to enjoy the peace and quiet. If material identity theory depends upon reducing the mind and mental states to biological processes, then functionalism places the focus back on the mind as a central system. However, it avoids reducing the notion of mind to the realm of the physical. Sensor information is realised in the nervous system and transported by way of electrical and chemical means, but the properties of experiencing vision or sound are not in themselves physical. However, neither are they supernatural. Mental states are to be considered as functional. They play a causal role in the system of mind. The function of the heart is to pump blood around the body. In the end, it's not important that the heart is constituted of organic tissue. After all, modern healthcare has developed synthetic organs of all types. What matters is the function. The function of an object empowers it to play a particular causal role. Being a heart is not reducible to being a biological object. It possesses both properties, but they're not identical and not necessarily correlative. An important characteristic of this is that of multiple realizability. This is the notion that two systems structured in different ways or even made out of different materials can be used to run the same programs. In other words, the output is not to be identified with the system itself, but is a function of that system. In terms of computational processes, the output of the software is not to be identified with the hardware. Heil said, "Philosophers of a functionalist bent prefer to say that computational processes are implemented by or realized in material systems. States of mind resemble computational states, at least to the extent that they could occur in principle in many different kinds of material system." As I've said, the implication is that human consciousness might conceivably be recreated in other ways than on the basis of having a brain. It sounds rather silly, but hypothetically, aliens in other galaxies might have green-coloured silicon bodies and yet have the opportunity to evolve conscious mental states, as has happened on Earth. Furthermore, the implication is that a computer could be built with the right hardware and software that could also recreate conscious states. Heil said, "Functionalists, embracing the multiple realizability of mental properties, reject the identity theory. Identity theorists are regarded by functionalists as narrow reductionists, philosophers who seek to reduce the mental, and maybe anything else, to the material. Functionalism is staunchly anti-reductionist, firmly committed to a conception of the universe as containing distinct and irreducible levels of things and properties." Most functionalists are probably closet physicalists, but actually, functionalism in itself doesn't imply physicalism. The critical point is that the ontological commitment is to an entity of function rather than of a physical entity. This is not to deny the correlation between the human mind and brain, but to suggest this connection is not an essential one. Human mental items are realized by the brain and the nervous system, but are not necessarily to be identified with this. I'll return to issues of modality soon, but for now it's enough to describe function operating as a holistic web. It's like using all the skills together required to play a musical instrument. None of those skills are reducible to the others. The stone observation tower behind me was constructed in the mid-19th century, after the classical era, in honour of Duchess Maria Pavlovna. It's now the oldest lookout tower in the Thuringian forest. There are 107 steps to the viewing platform at the top, and I've urged my children to the top to enjoy the wonderful views. In one direction you can look towards Erfurt and Weimar, and in the other direction you can look over the wide expanses of woodland that constitute the Thuringian forest. It's as good a place as anywhere to take stock and consider that, although functionalism remains the orthodoxy of both cognitive science and philosophy of mind in the modern time, there have been a number of objections raised. Firstly, empiricists are always liable to remind everybody that functionalism is an abstract concept of the mind that cannot be justified empirically. As Hume said, causal relations cannot be determined in themselves, only the effects of causal relations can be observed and measured. The intent isn't to refute a methodology that seeks a best fit scenario for available empirical evidence. To do so will be to refute all science theory. It's just to point out that functionalism is just a theory, not an observable phenomenon. Secondly, when functionalism is coupled with another prime notion of naturalism, the evolutionary impulse, there's the implication that mental states are not just a function of the physical states of the brain, but that mental states have evolved to be a function of the brain for reasons of some function. The mental state of pain is a function of the brain that in itself possesses the function of highlighting the need for attention to the physical systems to maintain optimal fitness for survival and the passing on of genes to the next generation by way of breeding. If I experience a pain in my toe, then the function of the pain is to alert me to a problem in my toe. If the pain is a sharp pain rather than a throbbing pain, that will provide me more information about the nature of the problem. Perhaps it would indicate a cut rather than an infection. Presumably, this could be considered a valuable evolutionary trait. In other words, functionalism implies it has a functional purpose itself. It implies that everything biological is underpinned by function and purpose, even if sometimes those purposes may be indirect. And the implication of this is that aesthetic states are also functions of brain states, which develop by way of natural selection as a function for supporting fitness. All of these examples suggest that rather than existence being characterized as a non-thinking machine, existence is driven by function and purpose themselves. The brain and mental states are the result of natural selection, which is driven, by way of an internal will to replicate, to improvement. Perhaps the most powerful objection to the functionalist account is that it doesn't explain all mental states, and in particular it doesn't explain phenomenal experience itself. It doesn't explain the qualitative feel of pain in the toe, or the experience of greenness, or the beauty of Bach counterpoint. If I hear an oboe playing, and I know that sound has a particular waveform, even if I theorise that aesthetics has function, this doesn't explain why my experience of the timbre is the way it is. Functionalism not only fails to address these questions, it ignores them. Just as material identity theory chose to belittle and ignore property dualism by explaining it away reductively, so functionalism dismisses the entirety of qualitative experience as non-existent, or subject to eventual reduction at best. However, given that the entirety of human experience and knowledge is experienced in qualitative terms, even numbers are experienced qualitatively, as well as the abstract quantitative, then it's not hard to argue, especially if you're a musician or a hiker enjoying beautiful views, that functionalism is missing something important. I should explore this matter further. If functionalism doesn't address qualitative experience and suggests that it's irrelevant or not necessary to a theory of consciousness, the implication is that a human could get by without it. A human could function perfectly normally with all the full mental faculties of being able to respond to toe pains and oboe waveforms with a full complement of psychology behaviours, but not be cognizant of the qualitative feel of experience. They could function with level 3 intentionality alone, without the level 2 self-reflection of consciousness, and without any awareness at all of level 1 entity of mind. From the outside they would appear as normally functioning humans, but unbeknown to all, they would in fact be walking, talking zombies. Not the living dead of children's movies, but with a mind that was not conscious. David Chalmers asked his readers to consider the logical possibility of a zombie world, a world physically identical to ours, but in which there are no conscious experiences at all. In such a world, everybody's a zombie. He's arguing that these creatures would have functional beliefs and desires and feelings and emotions, yet lack the associated dimension of inner qualities. The point of this is that the qualities of consciousness, including self-awareness and the aesthetics of phenomenal experience, are contingent. They're not essential to conscious states of mind, and therefore qualitative experience is not necessarily intrinsic. If this creature, who can be in pain and yet not experience the qualitative inner feel of this pain, while at the same time behaving as if they do, was to walk the earth, then its most important role would not be to terrorise the living, like the Walking Dead, but specifically to put fright into functionalists whose theories would have failed them. I'll look at the work of Chalmers in a subsequent episode and his justification for Russellian monism, which seeks to identify a common ground that might unify the theories of functionalism and phenomenalism. But I've said enough for now. I'll finish with another section from the third movement of my piece, Into the Fire, without saying anything further about the function of the music.